Hello, welcome to yesterday's Airlines. Time for another release announcement ranking video. This time round it's geminijets who announced their February releases just yesterday. There have been several release announcements from the manufacturers over the past week. We've had NG, which I've already done the video for, jcwings and Phoenix, both of which will get upcoming videos. But today it's geminijets, partly because they release a much smaller number of models than everyone else, so it's quicker to do the video. Now, Gemini have been having an okay year, and in January they announced quite an interesting set, at least by Gemini standards. They had that interesting Aviator 737-200, and I've seen pictures of the model, and actually it looks okay, bearing in mind that the mold is ancient. They also released the Emirates A300, and I've seen that too, and that's not okay, and it's as bad as we all kind of feared, I think, using that old JetX mold. But the printing looks okay. It also seems more expensive than some of the other models around it, and perhaps that's due to the Emirates licensing. Regardless, it added some interest, even if it wasn't necessarily good interest. And the rest of the release set wasn't awful either. There was a CRJ to keep our American chums happy. There was also Delta 757, which also kept some people happy, and United 787. So it was the usual kind of stuff, but at the same time, there were some interesting bits and pieces. And the highlight of last month was, of course, the KLM City Hopper E195E2, a model which I have actually acquired for review purposes and wrote the review on just the other day. So check out my review of that KLM City Hopper E195 if you haven't seen that already. I actually quite like that model, and I think Gemini did a good job. So that one for me was the highlight of last month, but the Aviator was a nice surprise too. This month we've got the usual number of releases, 9 or 10 if you include the flaps down as a separate release. They are nowhere near as interesting or varied as the January announcements. In fact, this is a real return to kind of boring Gemini, I would say, and I don't really feel a lot of good feelings anyway for most of the models that they've announced. But we will take a look at those in just a moment, so hang on for that. But before we do that, obviously, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, chuck a like on the video. Thanks very much, everyone. Follow me at Airlines on Instagram, and obviously also check out the website yesterdaysairlines.com. Always tons of news coming through the site and my other channels. Just recently announced the Phoenix IL96-400 mold, which is looking like it could be really good, and have also been talking about the wittywings 747-800, which again, an interesting and unusual new entrant to the market. So there's always loads of cool stuff to check out on the site. But let's get on and see what Gemini are giving us in, well, it'll be March, I guess, before they show. Okay, now one of the things to say about this set is it shows a shocking lack of diversity. Of the models that we have here, they are almost all North American, except for one which is British and one which is French. So that's, very Gemini. And I find it somewhat ironic that ngmodels has been getting kind of told off by American collectors for releasing too many Chinese models, when every month Gemini just pump out bucket loads of American stuff. The reality is that NG have a vastly better geographical range, and yeah, for everyone from America, I hope you're aware there are, a good 7 billion other people on the planet, and a lot of other places that fly airplanes. So there are other countries that deserve models as well. And NG are producing a lot of American stuff. It may not feel like it, but it is. Just go back and check the actual records. But anyway, we're here to talk about Gemini. And as I say, it's not especially diverse this month in terms of both the geography and also the airlines, because they're very Gemini-esque carriers this month as well. We're going to start off with a couple of American Airlines Airbus A321s. I think both of these were announced previously as future releases, so it's not a surprise to see them. They are both wearing heritage liveries. First up, there's N581 Uniform Whiskey wearing the, and I've got to say it correctly, haven't I? It's the Piedmont version of the heritage scheme, and then there's N582 Uniform Whiskey wearing the Pacific Southwest version of the scheme. Both really nice schemes, look great on the A321 in real life, but do they look great on the Gemini A321? Now that's a different question altogether. The Gemini A321 is a perfectly middling mould. It's not great, it's not dreadful, at least when it's not a Neo. It's okay. No, both of these aircraft are carrying the IAE engines, and so they're slightly better sized on the mould than the CFMs. It's a mould that I generally try and avoid, I admit, as in keeping with a lot of the jcwings Escamolds. The aerials are a bit big, the undercarriage is a bit short and chunky. It just doesn't quite have the best feel to it in comparison to the better A321s on the market from NG, HYJL, Panda. All three of those molds are better. But none of them have made these versions. The only people that have made these two schemes are Aeroclassics, who made them literally just this month as well, in an odd coincidence. Now, I guess whether you bought those and whether you prefer the Gemini depends largely on your view of Aeroclassics not fitting aerials and having more simple landing gear, and whether you think the Aeroclassics mould is better than the Gemini mould. And I would say that the mould as a whole is probably a little bit better, but that obviously lacking the extra detailing and the print quality that Gemini will bring does mark down the Aeroclassics version somewhat. So the other thing, obviously, also that I should point out here is that the Aeroclassics versions would have been made in much lower numbers, probably only in the early hundreds, whereas there's a good chance that there will be at least 400 or 500 of each of these floating around from Gemini. So these ones will be much easier to find from Gemini as well. I get the feeling these will be quite well looked upon by our American friends and reasonably well sought after, and I think a lot of younger collectors probably won't have been interested in the Aeroclassics for the reasons I mentioned. So I get the feeling these will be decent, not spectacular, but decent models and pretty hot. So I'm going to put these in the high flyer. Now I could easily workhorse these because of the mold, but I'm going to put them in the high flyer. I think they'll be decent, but not spectacular. Next up, we've got a couple of A320s, and a lot of what I've just said about the A321 obviously fits to the A320s as well. First up, we've got Air Canada jets, this all-black scheme, C, Foxtrot November, Victor Victor, and I've talked about this model, or this aircraft, multiple times because it has been released not only by Phoenix, but also by ngmodels just recently, and, you know, looking at those versions, is this Gemini 1 going to be better? I think that it's highly unlikely. I mean, even the Phoenix version looks quite nice in the pictures I've seen. The NG one certainly has got a much better mould. So, yeah, this is one of those times when Gemini are releasing after competition that has produced something which is better. And it does show up some of the weakness, I guess, of the Gemini model. This is just a workhorse release. Again, it's not going to be bad. The engines will seem a bit big. They often do on these CFM-powered A320s. But it isn't going to be awful. But it is superfluous because you'd have probably bought the NG if you had any sense whatsoever. And if you didn't buy that, then you may well have got the Phoenix. Finishing off the A320s is a new aircraft. It is a Transavia A320 Neo. They're just beginning to replace their 737 fleet with Neos. This aircraft is actually flying for Transavia France as opposed to the original Transavia Dutch version. The reg is FG Neo. Yeah, again, I mean, these molds are getting gradually worse. The A320neo from Gemini is worse than their CFM powered one, which is worse than the IAE powered one, and that's because the engines. The early Gemini Neos that they released were shocking in their ugliness. I had a Latam one; it was an embarrassment of a model, and I got rid of that almost immediately after the review was done. The engines literally dragged along the ground, and the undercarriage looked rubbish. The nose was oddly shaped, the tail cone was bad, but they have improved the mould. They've modified the tail cone, slightly changed the look of the nose. The undercarriage does seem nicer too, and the engines at least are off the ground, even if they are still too big. So, looking at pictures of the very recent Spirit Neo that was produced, it doesn't look like a complete abomination. Having said that, obviously, this is still one of the worst Neos on the market. Yeah. The temptation is to put this down into Gas Guzzler, and I have done that with the Neo mold before, but looking at that Spirit version, it doesn't look as bad as it might, and maybe there's hope that this one will also look okay. I'm going to put this one in the workhorse as well. Feeling generous maybe, but yeah, it is new. It is new, nobody else has made it, so maybe just elevates it somewhat out of the gutter. Okay, now that brings us on to Boeing 737s. And the next one is a WestJet aircraft. C Golf Whiskey Sierra Lima is the reg. Gemini released their new-ish 737-600 mold. Was it last year? I think it was. It just doesn't look very good. Mainly because of the undercarriage, I think, which just looks poor, but the rest of it isn't looking spectacular either, I have to say. The pictures of the EG and G release they did, it just looks weird, looks a bit odd. And what doesn't help it is that NG have obviously got a Series 600 mold, which looks spectacularly better, and have released this very same livery aircraft combo before as well. I just don't know, again, why you would get this. You'd have to not know NG existed to have missed the previous one and then buy this Gemini one. So it just feels like Gemini sometimes is playing on the ignorance of chunks of the marketplace and releasing models which are going to be weak, because that 737-600 mold that they've put out is just not a mold that should really exist in 2024. It's not good enough. It just across the board looks inferior. So, yeah, I'm going to put this one in to Gas Guzzler. Don't like the mold. Model doesn't need to be made. And you can say that very much about their other 737 next generations as well, which is a shame. They seem to almost be getting worse rather than better. Obviously, that Avelo one was a real low point with the really poorly fitted wings, but they've had a bit of that recently. The next aircraft in the release set is an 800, and it's Southwest Airlines Nevada 1 N8646 Bravo. And this aircraft actually hasn't been made before, which is surprising somewhat because there have been a lot of Southwest releases. The scheme is good. It's obviously quite a classic, retro, almost heritage, state scheme that Southwest have had for quite some time. It's not the most attractive of their state schemes, in my opinion, but it's nice enough. But the problem is the mould. I mean, the mould is just not really up to spec, and you're never quite sure what Gemini are going to do in terms of putting the thing together. Looking at a recent Transavia version, it doesn't look as bad as it might, but I'm still just thinking this mould needs replacing. It's just not good enough nowadays. I'm going to put this one in to Gas Guzzler as well. I just don't think that it's going to look particularly nice, and it certainly isn't going to sit nicely next to versions from NG, which are a much better mould. So Yeah, whereas I was perhaps generous with the Transavia, I'm feeling less generous with the Southwest, and I'm going to put this one down into gas guzzler. And that leaves just 3 models for us to discuss. The next model is quintessentially Gemini. It is United States Air Force. It's a VC-25B, which is the 747-8 that is going to be turned into Air Force One. I think there are a couple that are being turned in. The program is a little late and running over budget, as these things tend to. But the aircraft has been changed from the Trump era livery to the more classic look, albeit slightly modified with a different shade of blue and the removal of the metal panel because the aircraft is no longer made of metal, obviously. And yeah, it looks like it will be nice, and I would expect this to be a big seller in the States. Obviously, very patriotic people, so I would expect that even though there's a good chance that moron Trump is going to get back into power, people will still be flocking out to buy this. So, yeah, this one's so far away from my collection criteria that I find it a little hard to score. The mold is decent, if not amazing. Again, it's not best in class, but it's certainly not bad. And nobody else is going to make this. I imagine it'll sell well in the States. I'm going to put this one in high flyer as well, for those reasons. Next model on the list is a 767-300. It's an ER freighter. C Golf X-Ray Hotel Mike. It's Air Canada cargo. If this feels familiar, it is because it is. It has been announced and released by Phoenix, and that wasn't very long ago. It was towards the end of last year, though they released a different reg. Doesn't really matter, the aircraft is fundamentally the same. Yeah, again, hard to get excited when they're just making the same things that others have made. Will this one be better than the Phoenix version? It'll probably be about the same. Both the molds have got issues, but both of them are also solid, reliable, decent molds. But I can't really get excited about it. If I had really been interested in this aircraft, I would have just bought the Phoenix at the end of last year. So I'm going to put this one into workhorse. And the final model of this group is a British Airways 777-300ER. In fact, a pair of British Airways 777-300ERs, because one of them is available in flaps down. I quite like flaps down, it's good. But I don't tend to buy that many flaps down variants. I have to say it's good, but at the same time it also doesn't really feel necessary in the collection. The reg of this aircraft is GST Bravo Hotel. There have been quite a few British Airways 777-300ERs recently. This pair will make it 10 in the current scheme, plus there was an NG Landor Retro as well. There have, in recent times, been examples made by Aviation 400, which were superb. They were made as ARD exclusives, though, so they're a little hard to find. There have also been at least 3 versions made by Phoenix, and there have previously been other Gemini versions, albeit not on this mold. And this mold is obviously the jcwings mold. It's going to be really nice. It is a good mold. The question, I guess, is if you really wanted a BA 777, you'd have almost certainly got one of the ones from earlier. And that, once again, rather colours my view of this release. I'm sure it'll be really nice. It's a good mould. Flaps down's interesting too. There's probably a market for it. But it's not very interesting. And there are earlier versions. And if you were a proper BA collector, you'd almost certainly got 1 or 2 of those already. And arguably, the Aviation 400 one is as good or better. So yeah, I'm going to workhorse this one as well. I just don't feel the love for it. And I guess that kind of sums up my feeling about this month's Gemini set. Whereas last month, there were some things to get you interested. The Aviator, the KLM, and even the Emirates, you know, it was a spark of interest, even if it was sadly snuffed out. This month, it's incredibly bland. The American A321s, are probably the highlight, and that's, those models could easily be workhorse models if I was being a little harsher and just going on the mold alone. Whereas everything else has either been made and been made better before, or is being released on really inferior molds. I guess, from an airline perspective or an individual perspective here, that Southwest is also quite high because it's not been made before, but at the same time, the mold's just bad. And you could say the same about Transavia. Both those could easily be gas guzzler, and I've only put one in. So, yeah, for me, it's not a great month for Gemini. It really illustrates one of the issues that you have when you only release 10 models a month, i.e. that it's difficult to provide a range, but also just illustrates that Gemini's home market is very much United States, and they don't really give much else a look in. But the worst, I guess, aspect is really just that Gemini persist in releasing models on molds that are pretty inferior. And though they are producing some new good stuff like the E195, E2 that I reviewed, they're also releasing new stuff on molds that are still look really poor, like that 777-600. So it's just not great. It's not stellar stuff. It's very mediocre. And maybe that's all the market is crying out for. Certainly, Americans still seem to lap up these Gemini releases, even though the quality is often not the best. Don't know. But either way, it's not a great month. Can't see me being even vaguely interested in any of these releases. And I was interested in 3 or 4 last month. So yeah, I guess I'm not their target market. Okay, anyway, that's my view of this month's Geminis. A little disappointing, but not surprising. I should hopefully get to the jcwings and Phoenix videos. Some interesting diversity there. So a good counterpoint to these Geminis. Thanks very much for watching. That's it from this video. I'll see you next time. Yesterday's Airlines.